Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something a little different. Something kind of dark, but also weirdly mundane. We're diving into the daily lives of medieval executioners. And I mean their actual daily lives, not the dramatic stuff, not the big public spectacles, just how they lived, where they shopped, who they talked to, whether anyone would sit next to them at the tavern, that sort of thing. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, get comfortable. This is going to be a long one. And honestly, it's kind of perfect for falling asleep to, because we're not here for the shocking moments. We're here for the slow, strange reality of being the person nobody wanted to invite to dinner. Let's start with the obvious question. What was it actually like to be an executioner in medieval Europe? And I don't mean philosophically. I mean practically, because these people existed. They had jobs, they had families, they paid rent, they bought bread, they presumably had bad days and good days just like everyone else, except, their job was to end people's lives for the state, which made things a bit awkward at the bakery. Here's the thing about medieval executioners. They were absolutely necessary. Every town of decent size needed one. Laws required their existence. Somebody had to carry out the sentences that courts handed down. But at the same time, nobody wanted to be near them. They were essential and completely ostracized all at once. It's this bizarre contradiction that defined their entire existence. The technical term for this job, by the way, varied depending on where you were. In German-speaking regions, they were called Scharfrichter, which literally means sharp judge. In France, bourreau. In England, hangman, or just executioner. But regardless of the name, the social position was pretty much the same everywhere. They were necessary, they were paid by the state, and they were treated like walking contamination. This wasn't just casual dislike either. This was codified, legal, official ostracism. In most of medieval Europe, executioners were considered unehrlich, which is a German word meaning dishonorable or without honor. And this wasn't an insult, it was a legal category. They literally did not have honor in the eyes of the law and society. They couldn't hold public office, they couldn't join guilds. In many places, they couldn't even enter a church, or if they could, they had to stand in a special separate area. They were legally separated from normal society. And it gets weirder, because this dishonor was considered contagious. If you touched an executioner, you could become tainted. If you shook his hand, ate with him, drank with him, you were risking your own social standing. So executioners lived in this strange bubble of isolation, even though everyone knew who they were, and their work was extremely public. Most towns required executioners to live outside the town walls, not in the nice part of town, not even in the okay part of town, outside, literally beyond the boundaries of civilized society. They'd have a house, usually provided by the town council, somewhere on the outskirts, near the gallows often, because, of course, why not put the guy near his workplace? Made sense, practically speaking, but it also meant he was physically separated from everyone else all the time. These houses were often pretty decent, actually. The town had to provide them, and they needed to be large enough for the executioner's family, and sometimes for holding prisoners before sentences were carried out. So we're not talking about tiny shacks. But they were isolated, lonely. You'd wake up every morning and look out at the town you served but could never really be part of. Now, let's talk about money, because executioners were paid. They were public employees, technically. The town council hired them, set their salaries, and paid them from public funds. But here's where it gets complicated. The salary alone usually wasn't enough to live on. It was more like a retainer, a base amount to keep the guy available when needed. The real money came from fees,
per-job payments, and medieval towns had very specific fee schedules for this stuff, like written down in official documents. How much for a hanging, how much for a beheading, how much for breaking on the wheel, how much for whipping someone through the streets. It was all itemized, like a really dark menu. In Nuremberg, for example, one of the best documented executioner dynasties worked for centuries, and we have their payment records. A beheading might earn you the equivalent of a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. A hanging, slightly less. Torture, because that was part of the job too, had its own fee schedule. And if you had to travel to another town to do the work, you could charge travel expenses. It was a whole accounting system.
But even with these fees, the income was unpredictable. Some months you might have a lot of work, other months nothing. Crime rates fluctuated. Legal proceedings took time. You couldn't exactly plan your budget around how many people would be sentenced to hang that quarter. So executioners needed side hustles. And oh boy, did they have side hustles. The most common secondary job was knacker, which is a fancy old word for someone who deals with dead animals. Specifically, someone who collected dead livestock, skinned them, rendered the fat, sold the hides, and disposed of the carcasses. This was considered a dishonorable profession too, so it was a perfect fit. Executioners often had a monopoly on this work in their towns. If your horse died, you called the executioner. He'd come haul it away, and you'd pay him a small fee. He'd then butcher it, sell what he could, and pocket the profit. They also frequently worked as animal healers, which sounds contradictory, right? The guy who hauls away your dead cow also tries to heal your sick cow. But it made a weird kind of sense. They had anatomical knowledge from their main job. They understood bodies, even if those bodies were usually human and usually very much past the point of healing. They knew about blood, bones, injuries. So people, despite their general disgust, would sometimes bring sick animals to the executioner, especially if the town didn't have a proper veterinarian, which most didn't. Some executioners also sold medicine, folk remedies mostly. And here's where it gets really strange, because there was this widespread belief in medieval and early modern Europe that executioners had special healing powers, that they knew secret remedies, that parts of the bodies they dealt with had medicinal properties. So people would, very quietly, very shamefully, go to the executioner's house after dark and buy potions or powders or bits of fat or blood or other things I won't describe in detail because, we're trying to keep this chill. This was called executioner's medicine, and it was surprisingly popular, especially things like poor sinner's fat, which was rendered from the bodies of those who'd been executed. People believed it could cure all sorts of ailments. Was this true? No, obviously not. But demand was high enough that executioners could make decent money from it. The same people who wouldn't shake the executioner's hand in public would sneak to his house at night to buy his wares. The hypocrisy was honestly pretty stunning. So, on a practical level, a typical day for an executioner might look something like this. Wake up in your house outside town. Maybe you have work scheduled, maybe you don't. If there's no official execution or punishment happening, you're doing your other jobs. Someone sends word their pig died, you go collect it. You spend the morning skinning and butchering. You treat a farmer's sick dog. You prepare some remedy someone ordered. You do maintenance on your tools, which had to be kept in good condition because dull blades made your main job much harder and much messier, and nobody wanted that. If you do have official work scheduled, that's a whole different rhythm. Public punishments and executions usually happened at specific times, often late morning or afternoon, to ensure a good crowd. Because these were public events, meant to be witnessed, so you'd prepare, gather your tools, Maybe rehearse if it was a beheading, because you really didn't want to mess that up in front of hundreds of people. Your professional reputation depended on doing the job cleanly and efficiently. Then you'd go into town, to the scaffold or the gallows or wherever the sentence was to be carried out. You'd be in your professional clothing, which in some places was a specific uniform or color. Red was common in some regions, black in others. The crowd would part for you, not out of respect exactly, more of distaste. You were necessary, but you were still contaminated, still dishonorable. You'd do the job, carry out the sentence, and collect your fee from the town officials and go home, back outside the walls, back to your isolated house. And that was that. Another day, another few coins, another layer of social separation between you and everyone else. Now let's talk about family, because executioners had families. They married, they had children, and this created all sorts of problems, because remember, the dishonor was contagious. So who exactly could an executioner marry? Not a regular townswoman, that's for sure. Her family would never allow it. She'd become dishonorable too, just by marrying him. So executioners usually married within their own social circle, which meant the daughters of other executioners or the daughters of other dishonorable professions, knackers, skinners, latrine cleaners. The outcasts married other outcasts. This created these interesting executioner dynasties, families that held the position for generations. Sons followed fathers into the profession because, honestly, what else could they do? They were born dishonorable. They couldn't apprentice to a regular guild, couldn't become a baker or a carpenter or a merchant. Those professions were closed to them. So they learned the family trade. Father taught son, skills passed down through generations. One of the most famous executioner families was the Schmidts of Nuremberg. They held the position from the 1570s through the 1800s, multiple generations. The most well-known was Franz Schmidt, who worked from 1578 to 1617 and kept a detailed journal of his work. He recorded every job, every execution, every whipping, and between the lines of this professional record, you can glimpse his actual life. He mentions his family, his health problems, his hopes that his sons wouldn't have to follow him into the profession. Spoiler, they did, because what choice did they have?
Franz Schmidt executed or punished over 700 people during his career. That's a lot. And he wrote about it in this weirdly matter-of-fact way. Today, I beheaded so-and-so for theft. Afterwards, treated a townsman's horse for lameness, received payment of 3 gulden. Just another day at the office, another entry in the ledger. He also wrote about trying to improve his family's social standing. He wanted his children to escape the stigma. He saved money, he bought property, he tried to live respectably. And toward the end of his life, he actually managed to get his sons established in slightly more respectable positions. Not fully honorable, but better than executioner. It was possible, sometimes, with enough money and influence, to climb out of that pit of dishonor. But it was rare and hard. Most executioner families just stayed executioner families, generation after generation, because the barriers were too high, the stigma too deep. You were born into it, you lived in it, you died in it, and your children inherited it like a particularly grim family heirloom. The training process was informal but thorough. A boy growing up in an executioner's household would start learning young. Not the main job, not at first, but the surrounding work, helping with dead animals, learning anatomy, understanding tools, watching his father work from a distance at first, then closer, eventually assisting, holding things, preparing the scaffold, and finally, when he was old enough and skilled enough, carrying out sentences himself under his father's supervision. There was no formal schooling for this, no executioner academy. It was purely apprenticeship within the family, which meant the quality of executioners varied wildly. Some were highly skilled, professional, took pride in doing the job cleanly. Others were incompetent hacks who botched the work and made everything worse for everyone, especially the person on the receiving end. A skilled executioner was valued by the town council. They'd pay him better, give him bonuses, try to keep him from being poached by other towns, because yes, executioners could be headhunted. If you were good at your job, other towns might offer you better pay, better housing, better conditions. There was actually a labor market for this profession, weird as that sounds.
Living as an executioner meant living with constant low-level hostility. People needed you, but they didn't like you. Children threw stones at your house. Townspeople spat when you walked by, even when you were on official business. You couldn't drink at the regular tavern. In some places, there were specific taverns for dishonorable people, and that's where you'd go. Separate, always separate. Your children faced the same treatment. Executioners' kids were bullied, excluded, marked from birth. They couldn't play with other children, couldn't attend regular schools in places where schools existed. They grew up isolated, just like their parents. The sins of the father, except they weren't even sins, just the accident of birth into the wrong family. Some executioners tried to hide their profession when traveling. They'd go to another town where nobody knew them and just pretend to be someone else. But this was risky. If you were discovered, it could get ugly. People really didn't like being fooled into treating an executioner like a normal person. It felt like contamination by stealth. There are records of executioners being thrown out of inns when their profession was discovered, of refused service at shops, of being banned from attending weddings or funerals, even of distant relatives, because their presence would taint the event. It was relentless, this exclusion. Every single day, in every single interaction, you were reminded that you were separate, different, dishonorable. And yet they kept doing it, generation after generation, because they had to, because someone had to, because the pay was actually decent if you had enough work and managed your side businesses well, because once you were in, getting out was nearly impossible. So you made the best of it. You lived your strange, isolated, stigmatized life. You did your job. You raised your children to do the same, and you tried not to think too hard about the irony of being essential and despised in equal measure. The tools of the trade were important, and executioners often owned their own. Axes, swords, ropes, various instruments for various purposes. These were expensive, and they had to be maintained. A dull sword could turn a quick beheading into a nightmare of multiple strokes, which was bad for everyone involved and absolutely destroyed your professional reputation. So you sharpened, you oiled, you kept everything in working order.
Some executioners became quite famous for their skill with specific tools. There are stories of executioners who could behead someone with a single stroke every single time. This was considered the mark of a true professional. Speed, precision, efficiency. The goal was to carry out the sentence as cleanly as possible. Bungling it was shameful, and the crowd would let you know. They'd boo. They'd throw things. Your employers would be unhappy. So, you practiced. You took pride in your craft. even if that craft was incredibly grim. Let me take you through what we know about housing arrangements in more detail, because it's actually kind of interesting. The executioner's house was usually a specific building owned by the town designated for this purpose. It would be listed in town records, the executioner's house, located outside the east gate, near the place of execution. Very official, very matter-of-fact. These houses often had cellars for holding prisoners overnight before their sentences were carried out in the morning. They had workspace for the knacker business, for butchering animals. They had storage for tools and equipment. They were functional buildings designed for a specific set of very particular needs. Some of these houses still exist, by the way, preserved as historical sites. You can visit them, see where these families lived, see the rooms where children grew up knowing they'd never be accepted by the town just down the road. It's strange walking through those spaces. They're just houses, normal rooms, normal windows, normal fireplaces. But the weight of what happened there, the lives lived there, hangs heavy. The isolation wasn't total, though. Executioners did have some social contacts, other dishonorable professionals, obviously, and interestingly, sometimes Jews, who were also marginalized and excluded from mainstream Christian society in medieval Europe. There are records of executioners and Jewish merchants or moneylenders doing business together, sometimes even forming friendships of a sort. Outcasts finding common ground with other outcasts. There were also the prisoners themselves. Executioners often spent time with condemned prisoners in the hours before their sentences were carried out. This was part of the job. You'd bring them their last meal. You'd talk to them sometimes, try to calm them down. It was in your interest for them to be cooperative, after all. A panicking, struggling person made your job much harder. So you'd be almost pastoral in a weird way, offering what comfort you could, even if you were about to end their life. Some executioners took this aspect of the job seriously, saw it as a duty, recorded the last words of the condemned, their confessions, their regrets. Franz Schmidt did this, wrote down what people said to him in those final hours. There's something almost tender about it, in a very dark way. This connection between the executioner and the condemned, two people on opposite sides of state power, but in that moment, just two humans, one about to experience something terrible, the other tasked with making it happen. Okay, so we've covered the basics, the social stigma, the housing, the income, the family dynamics. Let's drift into some specific examples, because the details really bring this to life. Or, well, bring it to something. Life seems like the wrong word given the context, but you know what I mean. So let's talk about some actual people, real executioners whose lives we know about because they left records, or because town archives kept detailed notes about them. Because when you get into the specifics, when you learn their actual names and read about their actual problems, it becomes less abstract and more, human? Which is weird to say about people whose job was literally ending lives, but here we are. We already mentioned Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, but let's go deeper with him, because his diary is honestly one of the most fascinating historical documents from this period. He didn't just record his professional work, he recorded everything: family births, deaths, illnesses, money troubles, property purchases, his thoughts on religion, his hopes for his children. And all of it in this very calm, methodical handwriting, just Day after day, year after year, entry after entry. Franz took over the position from his father, Heinrich Schmidt, in 1578. He was in his early 20s. His father had been executioner in Bamberg before moving to Nuremberg, so Franz literally grew up in the profession. He watched his father work, learned the skills, and when Heinrich got too old to continue, Franz stepped in, as you do when you're an executioner's son and don't have a lot of other options. Over his nearly 40-year career, Franz executed 361 people and punished another 345 with non-terminal sentences. He kept track, numbered them, listed their names, their crimes, the method used. Today I beheaded Hans Schmidt, a thief with the sword. His body was placed on the wheel as an example. Then maybe the next entry is about buying a new house, or his daughter getting married, or someone paying him for treating their cow. Just life, continuing, mundane and terrible all mixed together. What's really interesting about Franz's diary is how he talked about his work. He didn't seem to enjoy it exactly, but he also didn't seem tortured by it. It was his job, his duty. He was employed by the city council to carry out lawful sentences, and he did it, professionally, competently. He took pride in doing it well, in being skilled, but there's no sense that he got any personal satisfaction from it. It was work, sometimes unpleasant work, but work nonetheless. He did mention times when things went wrong, when the sword hit bone and didn't cut clean, when he had to strike twice or 3 times. He recorded these failures too, very honestly, and you can sense his frustration in those entries. Not guilt particularly, but professional embarrassment. He'd messed up, in public, in front of the crowd and the town officials. That bothered him, the incompetence, not the act itself. Franz also wrote about money constantly, because of course he did. Everyone in every era worries about money. He listed his fees, complained when the town council was slow to pay, noted income from his side businesses. He was clearly very focused on building wealth, on establishing his family financially. And he succeeded, actually. By the time he retired in 1617, he owned several properties and had a decent amount of savings. He'd done well for himself, materially speaking. His retirement is interesting too. He petitioned the city council to be allowed to retire, citing his age and declining health. He was in his 60s, which was pretty old for that era. The council agreed and granted him a pension, a regular payment for the rest of his life. This wasn't automatic or guaranteed. It was a recognition of his long service, and it suggests that despite the stigma, despite the dishonor, good executioners who did their jobs competently for decades could earn a certain grudging respect from the authorities. Franz lived another 17 years after retiring, died in 1634 at 81, which was really quite remarkable for the time. And during those retirement years, he kept writing. Less about work, obviously, more about his family, his health, local events. The 30 Years' War was raging by then, and he wrote about troops passing through, about shortages and hardships. Just an old man watching the world continue to be complicated and violent, same as it ever was. His sons both became executioners in other cities. He'd hoped they'd escape the profession, had tried to set them up in other work, but it didn't take. The stigma was too much. They came back to what they knew, what they'd been raised in. And you can sense his disappointment about that in his writing, though he never stated it directly. Just quiet resignation. This is who we are. This is what we do. Let's float over to another example. The Reichardt family in Bavaria. They were executioners from the 1500s all the way into the 1900s. Actually, into the 1900s.
That's not a typo. Johann Reichardt, the last executioner of Bavaria, worked until 1946. He carried out sentences during the Nazi period and then during the Allied occupation afterward. Different governments, same job. Which is its own kind of horrifying when you think about it. But we're staying in the medieval and early modern period for now, so let's rewind. The early Reichardts, back in the 1500s and 1600s, lived the same kind of life as Franz Schmidt. Outside the town, doing the work, managing their side businesses. But what's interesting about this family is how they navigated the slow changes in society over centuries. Because by the 1700s and 1800s, the stigma around executioners was starting to soften a bit. Not disappear, but lessen. Some of the legal restrictions were being lifted. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about honor and profession and human dignity.
But even as late as the 1800s, executioners were still socially isolated in many places, still considered somewhat shameful. The Reichardts recorded incidents of being refused service, being excluded from events, being treated as lesser. Hundreds of years into their family's service to the state, and they still couldn't fully shake the stigma. It had loosened its grip, but it was still there, like a stain that had faded but never quite washed out. Now let's talk about the actual mechanics of the job, because we've been dancing around it, but we should address it directly. The work itself. What did an executioner actually do on a day-to-day basis? The big public events, the actual endings of lives, were relatively rare. Even in a decent-sized town, you might only have a handful per year. Maybe 10, maybe 20 in a bad year with a lot of crime. So that wasn't everyday work. That was occasional work. The rest of the time was filled with other things. Punishment that didn't end in demise was much more common. Whipping, for example. This was a frequent sentence for lesser crimes: theft, adultery, public drunkenness, petty offenses. The executioner would whip the offender through the streets, often following a specific route so as many people as possible could witness it. This was public humiliation as much as physical punishment. The crowd would follow, jeering, sometimes throwing things. The executioner would count the strokes, make sure he delivered the number the court had specified. Then it was done. The person went home, presumably having learned their lesson, though probably mostly having learned to not get caught next time. Branding was another common task, marking criminals with hot iron so everyone would know what they'd done. A T for thief, for example, burned right into the skin, usually on the hand or forehead, permanent, visible. Another form of public marking and shaming. The executioner would heat the brand, hold the person down, or have assistants hold them, and apply it. Quick, painful, over in seconds, but lasting forever. Then there were the humiliation punishments, putting people in the stocks or the pillory. This wasn't technically the executioner's job everywhere, but in some places it fell under his duties. You'd lock the person in, leave them there for the specified time, let the public mock them and throw rotten vegetables or worse. Then release them. Another day, another small enforcement of social order through public shame.
The executioner was also often involved in torture. And I'm going to tread carefully here because we're trying to keep this calm and sleepy. But it was part of the job in many places. Judicial torture. Used to extract confessions, especially in serious cases. There were specific rules about when and how it could be applied. A judge had to authorize it. There had to be substantial evidence already. It was regulated, bureaucratic even, but it still happened.
and the executioner was usually the one who administered it. This was considered skilled work, actually. You had to know how to apply enough pain to get the confession, but not so much that the person just said anything to make it stop, or worse, didn't survive to stand trial. There was a balance to it, a terrible, grim balance, and executioners were trained in it, learned the techniques, knew which methods worked for what purposes. It was part of their professional knowledge base. Some executioners hated this aspect of the job. Some were apparently indifferent. Some, presumably, enjoyed it, though sources are sparse on that, because it wouldn't have been something you'd admit or write down. But it was work, paid work, itemized in the fee schedules just like everything else. So many coins for so many hours, as clinical and businesslike as charging for fixing a fence or shoeing a horse, except obviously much darker. The actual ending of lives came in different forms, and the method was specified by the court. Hanging was the most common for regular criminals. Beheading was for nobility, or for those who'd been granted a merciful sentence. Burning was for heretics and witches. Breaking on the wheel was for particularly serious crimes, like highway robbery or multiple offenses. Each method had its own procedure, its own technique. Hanging sounds simple, but it actually required skill. You had to know how to tie the noose correctly, how to judge the drop, if there was a drop. Too short, and the person would slowly strangle, which took forever and was awful to watch. Too long, and you risked decapitation, which was messy and technically the wrong method. You wanted it to be quick and clean, professional. So you learned. You practiced on sandbags or sacks of grain, getting the knots right, the measurements right, because on the day, in front of hundreds of people, you needed it to get it right the first time. Beheading was considered the most honorable method, which is a weird thing to say, but that's how it was viewed. Nobility got beheaded. It was quicker, theoretically less painful, more dignified, but it required enormous skill. The person would kneel, place their head on the block. You'd raise the sword or axe. You had one shot, maybe two if you were unlucky, but ideally one. A clean cut through the neck, severing everything, quick and final. Miss, hit the skull, hit the shoulders, and you'd created a disaster. So executioners who specialized in beheading practiced obsessively. Some became genuinely renowned for their skill. People would request them specifically, paying extra to ensure a clean, professional job. The breaking wheel was, well, it was bad. We're not going to go into detail, but it was a slow method, meant to be a serious deterrent for serious crimes. The executioner's job was to carry it out according to the sentence. Sometimes the sentence specified mercy, which meant you'd deliver a secret final blow to end things quickly after the initial part. Sometimes not. You did what the court ordered. Then you went home. That was the job. Afterwards, there was cleanup. Bodies had to be dealt with. Sometimes they were displayed as warnings, hung in cages, left on wheels, mounted on spikes. The executioner usually handled this too. Sometimes they were buried, usually in unconsecrated ground since they'd been criminals. Sometimes the family could claim them if they paid a fee. To the executioner, naturally, everything had a fee. And then there were the side businesses, which we touched on, but let's expand. The knacker work was steady income. Animals died all the time. Horses, cows, pigs. Someone had to dispose of them. In most towns, this was legally the executioner's job. Nobody else was allowed to do it. Monopoly, granted by the town council. So when your ox died, you sent word to the executioner. He'd come with his cart, haul the carcass away. You'd pay him a fee, usually specified by town ordinance. Back at his house, he'd butcher the animal. The hide would be sold to tanners, the fat rendered for tallow used in candles and soap. Bones could be boiled down for glue. Hooves had uses too. Every part of the animal had some value, and a good executioner knacker knew how to maximize his profit from each carcass. It was waste management and recycling, medieval style. The animal healing work is fascinating because it shows the contradiction at the heart of the executioner's social position. People thought he was contaminated, dishonorable, barely human, but they also thought he had special knowledge, secret skills. They'd bring their sick animals to him, hoping he could cure them, and sometimes he could, because he actually did know anatomy. He understood bodies in a very direct, hands-on way. He'd seen inside them, knew what they worked, knew what organs went where. So an executioner might set a horse's broken leg, or treat a cow's infected wound, or diagnose what was wrong with a sheep that had stopped eating. He'd use folk remedies, herbal treatments, things passed down through the profession. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but he'd charge for his time either way, and people paid because they didn't have many other options.
The executioner's medicine business was even weirder. People believed materials from executed bodies had powerful healing properties. Blood, fat, pieces of bone, even the rope from a hanging. All of it supposedly had medicinal value. So there was this black market trade in these items, and executioners were the suppliers. They'd sell small vials of poor sinner's fat, bits of rope cut into tiny pieces and sold as charms against illness, powder made from various sources I won't specify. People bought this stuff, not openly. Nobody wanted to admit they were using executioner's medicine, but quietly, shamefully, they'd go to his house after dark and make their purchases. The executioner would keep some of these materials specifically for this purpose, part of the job, part of the income stream. And the same people who spat when he walked past during the day would knock on his door at night looking to buy his wares. The hypocrisy must have been breathtaking. But from the executioner's perspective, it was just business. They want to buy, I'll sell. Money doesn't care about honor or dishonor. Some executioners also worked as regular healers for living people, treating wounds, setting bones, dealing with various ailments. This was technically illegal in many places, since they weren't licensed physicians or members of any medical guild, but enforcement was spotty, and people in lower classes couldn't afford real doctors anyway. So they'd go to the executioner, pay his lower fees, take their chances with his treatments. And here's the thing. Some executioners were apparently pretty good at this. Franz Schmidt treated numerous patients over his career, noted successful treatments in his diary, broken limbs that healed properly, infections that cleared up. He clearly had some real medical knowledge, probably a combination of learned experience and folk tradition. He wasn't just a charlatan selling snake oil, though he probably did some of that too. He was providing actual medical services to people who needed them and couldn't get them elsewhere. So on any given day, an executioner might deal with a dead horse, treat a child's broken arm, sell a vial of medicine to a desperate mother whose husband was sick, do some maintenance on the town gallows, and prepare for a scheduled punishment the next morning. It was a strange, dark, and grim life. Also just mundane. Bills to pay, work to do, family to feed.
Let's talk about clothes, because even this was regulated. In many towns, executioners were required to wear specific colors or markings so people could identify them and avoid them. Red was common in German territories. Sometimes a specific hat or cloak. In some places, they had to wear a ladder symbol representing the gallows. just walking around town, marked, visible, always identifiable. On execution days, there might be specific ceremonial garments, more formal, sometimes provided by the town, sometimes owned by the executioner himself. You were representing the state's justice, had to look the part, so you'd dress up in your official capacity and perform your official duties, then change back into regular clothes, marked clothes, and go back to being the person everyone avoided. The marking requirements varied by region and changed over time. By the late 1700s, some places were dropping these requirements, but in the medieval and early modern period, they were common. Just another way of maintaining that separation. You couldn't accidentally interact with an executioner. He was marked, visible. You could avoid him as you were supposed to. Children of executioners sometimes tried to dress normally when traveling, hoping to pass as regular people in towns where they weren't known. But this was risky. If discovered, it could lead to violence. People really didn't like being tricked into treating dishonorable people as honorable. It felt like contamination by deception. So mostly, executioner families just accepted their marked status and lived with it. Religion is another interesting angle. The church had complicated views on executioners. On one hand, they were carrying out lawful sentences, serving the state, maintaining order. On the other hand, they were ending lives, which was technically sinful, and they were considered dishonorable by society, which the church generally went along with. In many places, executioners couldn't take communion with the rest of the congregation. They had to wait until everyone else was done, then receive it separately. Or sometimes they couldn't take it at all. They had to sit or stand in a separate part of the church, away from honorable people. Some churches wouldn't marry them or baptize their children in regular services. Special, separate arrangements had to be made.
Priests would visit condemned prisoners, hear their confessions, provide last rites. The executioner would facilitate this, but the priest and the executioner occupied very different moral positions in the eyes of the church and society. The priest was saving souls, the executioner was ending lives. One was sacred, one was polluted. Even though they were both just doing their jobs, both serving society in their assigned roles. Some executioners were apparently quite religious, went to church regularly, prayed, read scripture, tried to be good Christians despite their profession and the stigma attached to it. Franz Schmidt wrote about his faith, mentioned God frequently in his diary, seemed to believe he was doing God's work, or at least work that God permitted, carrying out earthly justice as ordained by lawful authority. He didn't seem to think his soul was damned because of his profession, or if he did, he didn't write about it. Other executioners were probably less religious or irreligious entirely. We don't have as many records from them because they didn't keep journals, but there must have been variety. Some believed, some doubted, some didn't care. Same as any profession, except their profession made their relationship with the church complicated and often painful. Executioners could also be called to work in other towns. If a town was too small to support a full-time executioner, they'd contract with the executioner from a neighboring larger town. He'd travel there when needed, do the job, charge travel expenses plus his normal fee, and go home. This was common. It created a sort of regional network of executioners who knew each other, sometimes cooperated, sometimes competed for contracts. These traveling jobs could be lucrative. You charged more because of the inconvenience and travel time, but they were also risky. You were traveling as a marked, dishonorable person. Some towns required you to enter through a specific gate, to lodge at a specific inn, usually one that catered to dishonorable people. You couldn't just show up and expect normal hospitality. Everything was conditional, restricted, marked by your status. There are records of executioners being harassed or attacked while traveling, robbed, beaten because who would defend the executioner? Who would seek justice for him? Sometimes local authorities would provide protection, an escort to and from the town, but not always. It was a risk you took for the extra money.
The professional network among executioners was real, though. They shared knowledge, techniques, tips. Sometimes they trained each other's sons, married their children to each other, created these extended family networks across regions. Outcasts forming their own separate society, parallel to the mainstream, but never intersecting except when necessary. There were also rivalries, competition for the better positions. Nuremberg was a plum job. Big city, steady work, good pay. If that position opened up, executioners from across the region would apply. There'd be politics, lobbying of town councils, calling in favors. Because a good position could set your family up for generations. A bad position in some poor small town with barely any work meant constant financial struggle. The town councils had all the power in these relationships. They hired, they fired, they set the fees, they determined the conditions of employment. An executioner who angered the council could be dismissed. His house would go to his replacement, his monopolies revoked. He'd have to find work elsewhere if he could. So executioners had to maintain good relationships with the authorities, be reliable, professional, obedient. But at the same time, they had some leverage, because the town needed them. Finding a new executioner wasn't always easy. The pool of qualified candidates was limited. If you were skilled and competent, the town didn't want to lose you. So good executioners could sometimes negotiate, ask for better pay, better housing, additional privileges. It wasn't a ton of power, but it was something. Some executioners became quite wealthy, owned multiple properties, had substantial savings, lived comfortably despite the social stigma. The combination of steady public salary, fee-for-service work, and side businesses could add up to a good income, especially if you were in a big town with plenty of work and you were good at managing money. Other executioners struggled. Small towns, infrequent work, poor management of their finances, died in poverty, left their families with nothing. It varied, like any profession. But the successful ones did quite well for themselves materially, even if they could never buy their way into social acceptance.
Let's drift into the daily routine in a bit more detail. Imagine you're an executioner in a mid-sized German town in, say, 1650. You wake up in your house outside the town walls. It's a decent house, 3 rooms, your family around you. Your wife, a knacker's daughter from the next town over. Your children, 2 sons and a daughter, all marked by your dishonor from birth. You eat breakfast. Bread, maybe some cheese if you've got it. Beer because water is questionable. Your oldest son, 14, asks if there's work today. You tell him no executions scheduled, but a farmer sent word yesterday about a dead cow. You'll go collect it this morning. He'll come with you, help with the work. He needs to learn. This is his future after all. There's no escaping it. You load up your cart. The town gates open at dawn, and you head in. People see you coming. They move aside. Nobody meets your eye. A child points, and his mother yanks his hand down, scolds him. You're used to it. Don't even notice anymore, really. It's just how things are. You make your way to the farm. The farmer is waiting, looking uncomfortable. He doesn't want to be doing this, doesn't want you on his property, but his cow died and it needs to be dealt with. You load the carcass. It's heavy and awkward, but you and your son manage. The farmer pays you the required fee, doesn't say thank you, just pays and turns away. You head back home. Spend the middle of the day butchering. Your son watches, helps. You show him how to skin cleanly, how to separate the hide without damaging it, how to cut away the fat, render it down, how to separate the parts that can be sold from the parts that are waste. It's messy, smelly work, but it's honest work, and it pays. In the afternoon, someone shows up at your door, a woman you don't recognize. She's nervous, keeps looking around to make sure nobody saw her come here. She asks if you have any medicine. Her husband is sick, coughing blood. The town physician wants more money than she has. You sell her a vial of something. Tell her to mix it with wine. Have him drink it morning and night. Will it work? Maybe. Probably not. But she pays and leaves quickly. And you've made a few more coins.
Evening comes. You do maintenance on your tools. Sharpen the sword. It's gotten a bit dull. You use a whetstone, carefully, the way your father taught you. The blade needs to be perfect. You never know when the town council will send word of a scheduled job. Have to be ready. Your wife makes dinner. Stew with vegetables from your small garden. You eat together as a family. Talk about the day. Your daughter mentions she saw a boy at the market who smiled at her. Your wife's face goes tight. She knows what will happen if the boy's family finds out their son smiled at an executioner's daughter. Nothing good. But she doesn't say anything, just serves more stew. After dinner, you sit and do some accounting. Write down the day's income, the fee from the dead cow, the payment for the medicine. Subtract your expenses. See where you stand. You're saving up to buy another property, trying to build something for your children. Even if they can't escape the dishonor, maybe they can at least have financial security. You go to bed. Tomorrow might bring more animal carcasses, might bring someone needing healing, might bring word from the town council of a scheduled punishment. You won't know until it happens. So you sleep and wake and continue. Day after day, year after year. A strange life, a hard life, but it's your life, the only one available to you. That's the reality of it. Not dramatic, not exciting, just a job, a life. Marked by stigma and isolation, yes, but also filled with the same mundane concerns as anyone else. Bills, work, family, hopes, disappointments. The same human experience, filtered through very unusual circumstances. And this went on for centuries, generation after generation of families living this way. The names changed, the specific towns changed, some details of the work evolved, but the basic pattern remained. You were necessary, you were paid, you were despised. You lived with all three of those truths, and you made your peace with it however you could.
Some executioners apparently became bitter, resentful of the society that needed them but rejected them. Some became withdrawn, isolated even within their own families. Some found comfort in religion, in the belief that earthly dishonor didn't matter in the eyes of God. Some just endured, got through each day, didn't think about it too hard. We didn't have psychological profiles, didn't have therapy or mental health support in that era, but you can imagine the toll. Living your entire life as a pariah, watching your children suffer the same fate, knowing that nothing you do will ever make society accept you. That must have been heavy, a weight carried every single day. But they kept going, because what else could they do? You can't quit being dishonorable, can't wash it off. It was who you were from birth or from the moment you entered the profession. So you lived with it, found what joy you could, took pride in your work, even if the work was grim, loved your family, saved your money, hoped for better, even if better never really came. And slowly, very slowly, over centuries, things did change. The Enlightenment brought new ideas. The Industrial Revolution brought new social structures. The old medieval categories of honor and dishonor started to break down. By the 1800s, executioners were still stigmatized, but less severely. Some were even able to send their children into regular professions. The barriers were weakening. But that was hundreds of years in the future for the medieval executioner. For the man living in 1400 or 1550 or 1650, the system was fixed, immovable. This was how things were, how they'd always been, how they'd always be. You did your job, you lived your separated life, and you tried not to think too much about the unfairness of it all. Let me tell you about one more person before we move on. Elite Tanzer, an executioner's wife in the 16th century Germany. We know about her because she left a brief legal record. She sued someone, successfully, for slander.
Someone in town had called her a whore, a common enough insult, but she took them to court. Argued that even though she was an executioner's wife, even though she was dishonorable, she still had a right to her reputation. The court agreed, awarded her damages. It's a tiny moment in history. One woman refusing to accept that dishonor meant she had no rights at all. She won. The slanderer had to pay her. And there's something quietly powerful about that. This woman, married to a man who ended lives for the state, living outside the town walls, marked and excluded, still had enough sense of self to demand respect, to insist that she mattered, even if society said she didn't. It's a good reminder that these weren't just historical figures, weren't just their jobs. They were people, full, complete people with dignity and pride, and the same fundamental human need to be treated fairly. They lived hard lives in a harsh system, but they lived, they endured, they mattered. Okay, that's a lot. Let's pause here, let the information settle. There's more to explore, but we need to let this breathe a bit. The daily life of medieval executioners. Strange, sad, mundane, and occasionally surprising. So we've covered a lot of ground. The basics of the profession, the daily routines, some specific people. But there's so much more to unpack here, because executioners didn't exist in a vacuum. They lived in specific places, in specific times, and the details varied quite a bit depending on where and when we're talking about.
Let's drift across Europe for a bit, see how things differed from place to place, because while the broad strokes were similar, the specifics could be really different, depending on whether you were in England or France, or the German territories, or Italy, or Spain. In England, the position was a bit different from the continent. English executioners, especially the ones in London, were often tied to specific institutions. The executioner of London was appointed by the sheriffs and worked primarily at Tyburn, the main execution site. They didn't always live in the same kind of isolated conditions as their continental counterparts. Some actually lived in the city, though still in less desirable areas. English executioners also didn't have the same kind of monopoly on knacker work. That was often a separate profession. So their income structure was different, more dependent on their fees for the actual job, less on side businesses. This made the position more financially precarious in some ways. If executions were infrequent, you might struggle to make ends meet. There's also this interesting English tradition of the executioner's right to the condemned person's clothing and possessions. After the job was done, the executioner could claim their clothes, any jewelry, whatever they had on them. This was considered part of the payment. So you'd have executioners stripping the bodies afterward, collecting their fee in fabric and personal effects. They'd sell these items later: a dead person's shoes, coat, hat. Morbid but practical. Waste not, want not. Some English executioners became relatively well-known figures. Not respected exactly, but known. There are records of them being recognized in the streets, pointed out. Some even became minor celebrities of a sort, in that specific English way of being fascinated by the macabre. But they were still socially marginal, still not people you'd invite to dinner.
The Tower of London had its own executioner, separate from the Tyburn one. This was a position specifically for dealing with high-status prisoners, nobility, political prisoners, people whose endings were matters of state. This was considered a more prestigious posting, if you can call anything about this profession prestigious. Better pay, more security, association with the crown, but still the same basic job, still the same social stigma. In France, things were structured a bit differently again. French executioners, the bourreaux, were often organized into regional networks. They had territories. Paris had its chief executioner, and he might have assistants or family members who worked in surrounding areas. There was a hierarchy, a system, more formalized than in some other places. French executioners also seemed to face particularly intense stigma. There are records of French bourreaux being attacked in the streets, having their houses vandalized, being refused service everywhere. The revolution changed things temporarily, obviously. Suddenly there was a lot of work, too much work. The executioner of Paris during the Terror, Charles-Henri Sanson, became a very notable figure. But we're staying mostly in the medieval and early modern period, so we won't dive too deep into that. What's interesting about France is that executioner families there also formed dynasties, just like in Germany. The Sanson family held the position in Paris for generations, father to son, over and over. Same pattern we saw with the Schmidts and Reicharts, because once you were in, your family was in, for better or worse. In Italian city-states, things varied wildly. Some cities had permanent executioners, others contracted them as needed. The social stigma existed but seemed less intense in some places, or at least differently expressed. Italian executioners sometimes held other positions simultaneously, worked as jailkeepers or guards, or in other roles connected to criminal justice. The work was more integrated, less separated.
There's also evidence that some Italian executioners were able to live relatively normal lives, at least compared to their Northern European counterparts. Attending church, doing business, not being completely ostracized, though this varied tremendously by city and by era. Venice was different from Florence, was different from Naples. Generalizing is tricky.
In Spain, executioners existed within the broader context of the Inquisition, which added whole other layers of complexity. Some worked for secular authorities, carrying out regular criminal sentences. Others worked for the church, dealing with heretics. The latter were involved in the burnings, the auto da fe. This was its own category of work, with its own rituals and procedures. Spanish executioners seem to face similar social stigma as elsewhere in Europe, marked, separated, dishonorable. But the religious dimension added something extra. You weren't just ending lives for the state, you were, theoretically, saving souls by purging heresy. The Church's justification for this work was elaborate and theological. Whether that made the executioners feel better about their jobs, who knows? Probably depended on the individual. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling mess of territories and principalities, had the most variation. Each region, each city had its own rules. Some followed similar patterns to what we've discussed. Others had unique local customs. But the broad framework of dishonor and exclusion was consistent. Executioners were unehrlich. That was universal across German-speaking territories. What's really interesting is how the legal framework around dishonor worked. It wasn't just social custom, it was law, written down, codified. Specific professions were listed as dishonorable. Executioners, obviously, but also knackers, skinners, grave diggers, night soil collectors, mill workers in some places, musicians in some places, people who worked with death or filth or entertainment, all grouped together as outside the boundaries of honorable society. And there were specific rules about contamination. If an honorable person ate or drank with a dishonorable person, they could be tainted. If they shook hands, if they did business together beyond what was absolutely necessary, contamination. This created this elaborate social dance where everyone had to be careful about who they interacted with and how. For executioners, this meant constant vigilance. You had to know your place, stay in your designated areas, use your designated entrance to the town, drink at your designated tavern. Any step outside those boundaries could result in violence or official punishment. The system was rigid and enforced both socially and legally.
But here's where it gets complicated, because society needed these dishonorable professions, needed executioners to carry out justice, needed knackers to deal with dead animals, needed grave diggers to bury the dead. So there was this constant tension between necessity and disgust. We need you, but we hate you. Do your job, but stay away from us. It must have been psychologically exhausting for everyone involved. Some executioners tried to fight the system, petitioned for their children to be granted honorable status, offered to pay large sums of money, called in favors with powerful people. Sometimes it worked. There are records of executioners' sons being allowed to apprentice to guilds, to learn honorable trades, but it required tremendous effort and usually substantial bribes. And even then, the stain of their origin often followed them. Others just accepted it. This is who we are. This is how things are. Stopped fighting and made the best of their situation, built their lives within the constraints, found meaning where they could. It's kind of heartbreaking, honestly,
but also understandable. At some point, you have to stop beating your head against an immovable wall and just live. Let's talk more about the actual families, the children growing up in executioner households. What was that like? You're born into this. You have no choice, no say in the matter. Your father is the executioner, therefore you're dishonorable. Therefore your life is predetermined in a lot of ways. As a small child, you might not fully understand. You play in your house, your garden, your father goes to work, comes home, normal from your limited perspective. But then you try to play with other children, and they run away, or their parents pull them away, and you start to understand you're different, separate, not allowed. School wasn't really a thing for most children in this era anyway, but executioners' children were especially unlikely to receive formal education. Some executioners taught their children to read and write at home, practical skills, math for keeping accounts, reading for contracts and official documents, but it was hit or miss. Many executioners' children grew up illiterate, same as most people of their class.
As you got older, the reality of your situation became clearer. You couldn't apprentice to a guild, couldn't learn a respectable trade. Your options were limited to dishonorable professions. Following your father into his work was the most common path. At least you had family to train you. At least you knew there'd be work eventually. Better than being set adrift with no prospects at all. For daughters, the situation was maybe even more limited. You could marry someone from another executioner family, or marry into another dishonorable profession, or maybe not marry at all. Stay home, help with the household work, the side businesses. Some executioners' daughters learned healing skills, helped their fathers with that aspect of the work, became healers in their own right, operating in that same gray market of unofficial medicine. There are records of young men from executioner families trying to run away, leave their hometowns, change their names, start over somewhere else where nobody knew their background. Sometimes it worked. If you could get far enough away, if you could keep your past secret, maybe you could build a new life. But if you were discovered, it could end very badly. Communities did not appreciate being infiltrated by dishonorable people pretending to be honorable. The family bonds in executioner households must have been strong, out of necessity if nothing else. You couldn't rely on the broader community, couldn't form friendships outside your immediate circle. So family was everything. Your parents, your siblings, your extended network of other executioner families. That was your world. That was your support system. Some families seem to genuinely make it work. You can see it in the records. Multiple generations staying close, helping each other, marrying within the network, creating this parallel society of executioner dynasties, all interconnected, all supporting each other because nobody else would. It's actually kind of beautiful in a sad way, making family bonds stronger because the outside world was so hostile. Other families fractured. The pressure was too much. Resentment built up. Why did you bring me into this world, into this life, into this stigma? Fathers and sons fighting, family members leaving, cutting ties, trying to escape even if escape was nearly impossible. The historical record is full of these little glimpses of family dysfunction, usually revealed in legal documents or town council records when things got bad enough to become official business. Let's talk about the physical toll of the work, because it wasn't just psychologically difficult, it was physically demanding too.
The actual job required strength, coordination, physical fitness. Swinging an axe or sword with enough force to cut through a neck in one blow, that takes serious upper body strength. You had to practice, build up the muscles, maintain your fitness. And the other aspects of the work were physically taxing too. Hauling dead animals, butchering carcasses, operating the various mechanisms and equipment, building and maintaining scaffolds and gallows. It was manual labor, often heavy manual labor. You came home tired, sore, covered in sweat and blood and worse. Injuries were common. Executioners could hurt themselves with their own tools, cut themselves, strain their backs, develop joint problems from repetitive motions. There's a record of one executioner who lost several fingers in an accident while sharpening his sword. Just gone. He kept working, adapted, but his grip was never the same, made the job harder, more dangerous for everyone involved. There was also the risk of disease, especially for executioners who worked as healers or dealt with dead bodies regularly. No concept of germ theory, no real understanding of how illness spread. You'd treat someone's infected wound, then eat dinner without washing your hands properly, because washing your hands wasn't really a thing yet. Or you'd butcher a diseased animal, get fluids on your skin, and just hope for the best. Some executioners died from illnesses they contracted through their work. Plague, obviously, if there was an outbreak and they had to deal with the bodies, but also other infections, fevers, mysterious ailments that modern medicine might have been able to treat, but medieval medicine had no idea about. It was a risky profession in multiple ways. As executioners aged, the physical demands became harder. Your strength wanes. Your coordination isn't what it was. Your hands shake a bit. And in a job where precision is absolutely critical, where hundreds of people are watching your every move, that's a problem. Some older executioners brought in assistants, usually sons or nephews, family members they could train and rely on, gradually transitioned the work to the younger generation while still collecting part of the fee.
Retirement, when it was possible, was a relief. If the town council granted you a pension, if you'd saved enough money, if your son could take over and support you, then you could stop, rest, let your aging body recover from decades of demanding, terrible work. Franz Schmidt's relief at being able to retire comes through in his diary. He'd served for nearly 40 years. He was tired, done, ready to let someone else carry the burden. But not all executioners got to retire. Some died in harness, still working into their 60s or 70s because they couldn't afford to stop. No pension, no savings, no son ready to take over. So you kept going, your hands shakier, your aim less certain, your body barely holding up, until eventually you couldn't work anymore. And then what? Hope for charity? Hope your family could support you? Hope you died before you became completely destitute? The lack of social safety nets made everything more precarious. You couldn't join a guild, so you didn't have guild support if you fell on hard times. The church might or might not help you, depending on the local priest's attitude toward executioners. You were on your own. Your family was on your own. Save money, build security, or suffer the consequences. Let's talk about the relationship between executioners and the prisoners they dealt with, because this was often a close relationship in a strange way. The executioner might be the last person the condemned spoke to, the last face they saw. That's intimate, even if the context is horrible. Some executioners took this seriously, saw it as a pastoral duty. They'd talk to the prisoner, offer comfort,
encourage them to confess their sins, make peace with God. This wasn't just kindness, though some of it surely was. It was also practical. A calm, resigned prisoner was easier to deal with than a panicking, struggling one. So you had an incentive to soothe them, help them accept what was coming. There are records of executioners praying with prisoners, holding their hands, speaking softly to them as they walked to the scaffold. "It will be quick. I'm skilled. You won't suffer long. Make your peace with God." True or not, it was what you could offer, a small mercy in a merciless situation.
Some prisoners apparently became almost friendly with their executioners in those final hours, talked about their lives, their regrets, their families. The executioner would listen. What else could he do? He was there. He was the only one there in that specific role. So he listened, bore witness, carried those final words with him afterward. Franz Schmidt recorded many of these conversations, the last words of condemned prisoners, what they said about their crimes, their lives, their hopes for the afterlife. He wrote it all down very matter-of-factly, but there's something compassionate about it too, preserving their last moments, making sure their final words weren't just lost to time. Other executioners were apparently less empathetic, saw prisoners as just part of the job, things to be processed, didn't engage emotionally, got the work done, and went home without thinking about the person they just dealt with. Emotional detachment as a survival mechanism, because if you thought too hard about the humanity of it all, how could you keep doing it? Better to compartmentalize, shut it away. Did executioners ever refuse to do the job? Rarely, very rarely, because refusing meant losing your position, your income, your house, everything. The town council didn't employ you to have opinions about who deserved their sentence. They employed you to carry out the sentences the court handed down. Your personal feelings were irrelevant. But there are a few recorded cases of executioners expressing reluctance or regret, usually around executing someone they believed was innocent, or a child, or someone they knew personally. The records are sparse because this wasn't something you'd advertise, but occasionally you get a glimpse of moral struggle. An executioner who dragged his feet, asked the town council to reconsider, begged for a delay. Usually it didn't work. Usually the sentence was carried out anyway, but the hesitation was there. The human recognition that this was wrong, even if wrong didn't matter in the face of law and duty. There's a famous case from 17th century Germany of an executioner who refused to carry out a specific sentence, a young woman accused of infanticide. He didn't believe she was guilty, told the town council he wouldn't do it. They threatened him. He still refused. Eventually, they had to bring in an executioner from another town. The original executioner lost his position, his house, his income, had to leave town. Last anyone heard, he'd become a beggar.
Did his stand matter? Did it change anything? Not really. The woman was still executed, just by someone else. But he couldn't do it, couldn't live with himself if he did. So he refused and paid the price, and that was that. It's a tiny moment of moral courage in a very dark system. Probably didn't help anyone, but he tried. Most executioners didn't have that luxury, couldn't afford to refuse, had families to feed, debts to pay, so they did the job, all of it, even the parts that bothered them, even the ones they suspected were unjust, because what choice did they have? The tools of the trade deserved more attention than we've given them. These weren't just implements, they were instruments that had to be maintained to an exacting standard. An executioner's professional reputation depended on his tools working correctly every single time. Swords used for beheading were expensive, custom-made usually. The blade had to be long enough, heavy enough, balanced correctly. You couldn't just use any sword. It had to be specifically designed for this purpose, and it had to be kept sharp, perfectly, absolutely sharp, because a dull blade was a disaster waiting to happen. There are specifications in some town records for exactly what kind of sword the executioner should have, the length, the weight, the type of steel. Towns sometimes paid for these swords, considering them official equipment. Other times the executioner had to provide his own. If you had to buy your own, that was a significant expense, multiple years' income potentially, but necessary. You couldn't do the job without the right equipment. Axes were cheaper, but required the same level of maintenance. Sharp edge, secure head, strong handle that wouldn't break under stress. You'd check it before every job, test the balance, make sure everything was solid, because if the handle broke mid-swing, where the head came loose, you'd have created a horrific mess in front of hundreds of witnesses, career-ending stuff.
Ropes for hanging had to be the right thickness, the right length, the right material. Hemp was common, strong but with enough give. You'd inspect them regularly, check for wear or damage, replace them when necessary. Some executioners made their own ropes, others bought them from rope makers. Either way, you needed a supply, and you needed to know how to tie the specific knots required for the job. Then there were the more specialized tools, breaking wheels, torture devices, branding irons. All of it had to be maintained, kept in working order, stored properly. You'd have a workshop area, probably in your house or a shed nearby, all your equipment organized, accessible, ready to be transported to the place of work when needed. Some executioners took real pride in their tools, kept them immaculate, decorated them even. There are surviving execution swords with elaborate engravings, sayings about justice, religious verses, the executioner's name and the date. These were professional instruments, but they were also a statement. This is my work. This is my craft. I take it seriously. Others were more utilitarian. Tools were tools. Keep them sharp, keep them functional, don't overthink it. Different personalities, different approaches, but everyone understood that your tools were fundamental to your ability to do the job. Neglect them, and you'd fail publicly, and failure meant shame, financial loss, maybe losing your position entirely. Training the next generation meant teaching them about tools, how to select them, how to maintain them, how to use them. A young executioner in training would spend hours practicing on sandbags, or dead animals, or wooden blocks, building muscle memory, learning the exact angle, the exact force, the exact motion, over and over until it was automatic, because on the day, in front of the crowd, you couldn't hesitate, couldn't think about it, had to just act cleanly and precisely. Fathers teaching sons, uncles teaching nephews, the skills passed down through demonstration and practice. Watch how I hold the sword, see the angle of the blade, feel the weight, now you try. Year after year of training before the young man was ready to actually carry out a sentence himself. And even then, the first few times were nerve-wracking. What if you messed up? What if you shamed your family? What if you proved you weren't worthy of the position? Some young executioners did fail their first few attempts, took multiple strokes, got flustered, made mistakes. Usually they got better with experience, but occasionally someone just couldn't do it. Didn't have the physical strength or the mental fortitude or the coordination. And then what? You were already marked as an executioner's son, already dishonorable, but you couldn't actually do the job. You'd probably end up in some other dishonorable profession, knacker work most likely, or grave digging, something that didn't require the specific skills of execution. The successful ones, though, they found their rhythm, learned the work, became competent, then skilled, then eventually took over from their fathers, and the cycle continued. Another generation, another lifetime of carrying out the law's harshest sentences while living outside the boundaries of respectable society. Money management was crucial. We've touched on this, but it deserves more attention. Because executioners could make decent money, but it was irregular. You might have a busy month with multiple jobs, fees piling up, income looking good. Then 2 months of nothing. No executions scheduled. Maybe some animal carcass work, some healing, some medicine sales, but not the big fees from official work. Smart executioners saved, built up reserves to get through the lean times, invested in property when possible, owned their own houses even if they had to live in them outside the town walls, bought fields or shops and rented them out, created multiple income streams so they weren't completely dependent on execution work. Others spent everything as it came in, lived well when times were good, struggled when times were bad, fell into debt, had to borrow money, often at high interest rates, because who wanted to lend to an executioner? The dishonorable couldn't access the same financial networks as honorable people, so they'd borrow from each other, or from the few moneylenders willing to deal with them, usually at unfavorable terms. Some executioners died deeply in debt. Their families had to sell everything to pay off creditors. The next executioner would move into the town-provided house, and the previous family would scatter, trying to find work elsewhere, starting over with nothing. The precariousness of it all was real and constant. The successful executioner dynasties, the ones that lasted for generations, were usually the ones who managed money well, saved, invested, built wealth, passed it down, created a foundation that could support the family even when work was scarce. Franz Schmidt did this, ended up quite wealthy by the standards of his time and class, left his children with property and savings, gave them a cushion even if he couldn't give them honor. Let's talk about the rare cases of executioners gaining some measure of respect or acceptance, because it did happen occasionally. Usually, it required extraordinary circumstances or exceptional individuals. Some executioners earned grudging respect through sheer competence. If you were really, really good at your job, if you never failed, if you carried out even the most difficult sentences with perfect precision, people noticed. They still wouldn't invite you to dinner, still wouldn't shake your hand, but there was a recognition. This man is a master of his craft, even if that craft is grim. Others gained respect through their side work. Executioners who were genuinely skilled healers, who saved lives as well as ending them, could build a different kind of reputation. People might still avoid them socially, but they'd acknowledge their medical knowledge, seek them out when desperate, and over time that could soften the stigma a bit. Not erase it, but soften it. There are a few cases of executioners being granted special privileges, allowed to enter the town more freely, given better housing,
invited to certain official events in their capacity as town employees. These were exceptions, not the rule, but they happened, usually for executioners who'd served for decades, who'd proven their reliability and loyalty to the town council beyond any doubt. And very, very rarely an executioner's child managed to escape into honorable society, usually on a combination of money, distance, and luck. Move to a different region where nobody knows your background, pay for an apprenticeship under a false name, keep your past secret, build a new life. If you pulled it off, if you were never discovered, you could escape. Your children would be born honorable. The stain would be washed away, or at least hidden well enough to function as washed away.
But these cases were so rare as to be almost mythical. Most executioner families stayed executioner families. The barriers were too high, the stigma too deep, the system too rigid. You were born into it, you lived in it, you died in it. That was just how things were. As we drift toward the later periods, the 17th and 18th centuries, you start to see some changes. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human dignity and the nature of honor. Some intellectuals started questioning whether executioners should really be considered dishonorable. They're performing a public service, after all, carrying out lawful sentences. Why should that be shameful? These ideas spread slowly, very slowly, but they did spread. Some regions started lifting the legal restrictions on executioners and their families, allowed them to join guilds, attend church normally, marry into honorable families, at least in theory. The practice lagged behind the theory, of course. Social stigma doesn't disappear just because the law changes, but it was a start. By the 1800s, in some parts of Europe, executioners were living relatively normal lives, still doing grim work, still somewhat avoided socially, but not completely ostracized, not legally marked as dishonorable. Their children could pursue regular professions. The rigid medieval system was breaking down. But that was hundreds of years in the future for the medieval executioner. For the man in 1450 or 1550, none of that change was even imaginable. The system seemed eternal, fixed, unchangeable. You were what you were, you did what you did, and you tried to find meaning and dignity within those narrow confines. And somehow, many of them did, found meaning in doing their job well, found dignity in providing for their families despite the obstacles, found purpose in serving the state even if the state didn't particularly appreciate them. They lived full, complex lives within a system that tried to reduce them to their worst function.
That's what strikes me most going through all these records. These weren't just executioners. They were fathers and husbands and sons. They had hobbies and interests. They worried about their children's futures. They had opinions about politics and religion. They fell in love. They mourned their losses. They celebrated their successes. They were human. Fully, completely human. The profession was grim. The social stigma was brutal. The isolation was real and painful. But within all of that, life happened. Human life, in all its complexity and mundanity. That's the part that gets lost sometimes when we talk about historical executioners. We focus on what they did, the dark parts, the sensational aspects. But they also just lived, woke up every morning, made breakfast, talked to their families, did their work, went to bed, day after day, year after year. And that's somehow more affecting than the dramatic parts, the sheer mundane humanity of it,
These people living these constrained, stigmatized lives and still finding ways to be people, to have dignity, to matter, at least to themselves and their families, if not to the broader society that used them and despised them in equal measure. Okay, we're deep into this now. Let me pause here. Let all of this settle. There's still more to explore, but we need to breathe a bit. The daily lives of medieval executioners. Strange and sad and surprisingly ordinary all at once.
All right, we're in the home stretch now. Let's bring this all together. We've wandered through centuries of executioners' lives, seen the patterns, met some of the people. But there are still some corners we haven't explored, some threads we need to tie up before we drift off into sleep. Let's talk about the relationship between executioners and the authorities they served, because this was complicated. The town council or local lord employed you, paid you, gave you a place to live, but they also held all the power. You were always dependent on their goodwill. A smart executioner cultivated good relationships with the officials, was punctual, reliable, didn't cause problems, submitted reports when required, kept accurate records of fees and payments. Basically, you were the model employee. Because if the council decided they didn't like you, you were done. No appeals process, no job protection, just out. There are records of executioners being dismissed for various reasons. Incompetence, obviously. If you consistently botched the work, the council would find someone else. But also for personal reasons, getting drunk and causing a scene, getting into fights, having affairs with the wrong people, anything that reflected badly on the town or embarrassed the authorities. Some executioners were fired for refusing to do certain tasks. We mentioned the one who refused to execute someone he believed was innocent, but there are other cases too. Executioners who balked at torturing children, who refused to participate in witch trials they considered unjust. These were rare, but they happened, and they usually ended the same way: dismissal, poverty, ruin. Most executioners didn't take those stands, couldn't afford to, so they did what they were told, followed orders, carried out sentences without question. This was your job, your duty, your only source of income. You didn't get to have opinions about the justice or injustice of specific cases. You were the instrument, not the judge.
But that must have weighed on some of them, knowing you'd ended the life of someone who might have been innocent, or guilty only of something trivial, or mentally ill and not really responsible for their actions. Medieval justice was rough, not particularly concerned with nuance or proportionality, and executioners were on the front lines of that roughness, carrying it out with their own hands. Some executioners apparently dealt with this by becoming very religious, focusing on the idea that earthly justice was flawed, but divine justice would sort it all out in the end. You were just doing your job. God would judge the souls. You were just facilitating the transition from earthly punishment
to heavenly judgment. Whatever helped you sleep at night, I suppose. Others became cynical, stopped thinking about guilt or innocence entirely. The court says this person deserves their sentence? Fine. That's all I need to know. Don't ask questions. Don't think too hard. Just do the work and collect the fee. Emotional detachment as self-preservation. And some probably fell somewhere in between. Had doubts, had moments of conscience, but ultimately kept going because what else could they do? Life is complicated. People contain multitudes. Executioners were no different. The public nature of the work added another layer of stress. These weren't private events. They were spectacles, public theater, meant to be witnessed by as many people as possible. So you were performing in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, all watching, all judging your competence. The crowd at a public execution was a mix of everyone, rich and poor, old and young. People brought their children, treated it like a festival. There were vendors selling food and drink, street performers working the crowd, a whole carnival atmosphere with a very dark centerpiece.
And in the middle of all that, the executioner, trying to do his job professionally while surrounded by chaos and spectacle. The crowd would cheer if you did well, boo and throw things if you messed up. They had expectations. They wanted efficiency, drama, but not too much drama. A clean, quick conclusion to the show. Some executioners played to the crowd, developed a theatrical style, made grand gestures, spoke loudly, announced what was happening, turned it into a performance. This could actually help your reputation if people remembered you as competent and professional, if they talked about how skilled you were. That enhanced your status, within the narrow confines of your profession at least. Other executioners were more understated, just did the work, no flourishes, no performance, got it done and got out. Different personalities, different approaches, but everyone was aware of being watched, being judged, having their work evaluated by hundreds of eyes. There are accounts of executioners making mistakes in front of large crowds and being attacked afterward, people pelting them with stones or rotten food, chasing them out of town. The crowd could turn quickly if things went wrong, and the executioner, already stigmatized and vulnerable, had no real protection. The authorities might step in, might not. You were on your own. So the pressure was real. Every public job was a test, a chance to prove your competence or reveal your inadequacy. And unlike most professions, your failures happened in front of hundreds of witnesses who would talk about it for years. No pressure, right? Let's drift into the late medieval and early modern period, when things started slowly changing. The 1600s and 1700s brought new ideas, the Enlightenment, rationalism, questions about traditional hierarchies and social structures.
Some intellectuals started writing about executioners, questioning whether they should really be considered dishonorable. After all, they're performing a necessary public service. They're employed by the state. They're carrying out lawful sentences handed down by courts. Why should that be shameful? Isn't the shame on the society that requires their services, not on the individuals performing them? These were radical ideas for the time.
Most people still believed in the traditional system of honor and dishonor, still treated executioners as contaminated. But the questions were being asked, the assumptions were being challenged. Slowly, very slowly, things began to shift. Some regions started reforming their laws, removing the legal disabilities on executioners and their families, allowing them to join guilds, to enter previously forbidden professions, to marry honorably. Again, the social reality lagged behind the legal changes, but it was movement, progress, however gradual. By the 1700s in some places, you had executioners living relatively normal lives, still somewhat avoided, still not quite respectable, but not completely ostracized either. Their children could become artisans or merchants. The rigid medieval categories were breaking down. Executioner dynasties that had lasted for centuries started to end. Sons choosing other professions, daughters marrying outside the dishonorable sphere. The position becoming less of an inherited family role and more of just a job. A grim job, yes, but a job nonetheless. One you could take or leave based on your own choice rather than your birth. This transition wasn't universal or smooth. In rural areas and conservative regions, the old stigma persisted well into the 1800s. But in cities and more progressive areas, change was happening. The executioner was becoming less of a social pariah and more of a civil servant with an unfortunate job description. The actual methods of execution were changing too. Guillotine in France, obviously. That revolutionized the process, if you can use that word, made it more mechanical, more certain, less dependent on the executioner's personal skill. You still needed someone to operate the device, to prepare the condemned, to handle the logistics, but the actual moment of death was mechanized, standardized. This changed the nature of the profession, less emphasis on physical skill and more on administrative competence. You were an operator of machinery rather than a craftsman with a blade. Some executioners welcomed this, made the job easier, less stressful, more reliable. Others apparently missed the old ways, the skill aspect, the craftsmanship. Strange thing to take pride in, but there you go. In England, hanging remained the primary method well into the modern era, but techniques improved. The long drop method, developed in the late 1800s, was designed to be quicker and more humane. The executioner's job became more scientific, calculating the correct drop distance based on the person's weight, positioning the knot correctly, using standardized equipment and procedures. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, executioners in most of Europe were just government employees, not marked, not dishonorable, just people with an unpleasant job. They lived normal lives, went to church, their children attended regular schools. The medieval system of stigma and exclusion was mostly gone. Mostly, because social attitudes changed slowly. Even in the early 1900s, executioners often kept their profession quiet, didn't advertise it, might tell people they worked for the government in some vague capacity without specifying exactly what they did. Because even without legal disorder, even without official stigma, people still found the work disturbing, still didn't want to think too hard about who was doing it. There are interviews with 20th century executioners talking about this, the isolation they felt, the inability to discuss their work with anyone.
coming home after a job and just sitting quietly, because who could you talk to? Who would understand? Your family knew but didn't want details. Your friends, if you told them, often drifted away, so you kept it to yourself, carried it alone.
In some ways, even without the legal and social structure of dishonor, the psychological isolation remained. Different form, same basic dynamic. You do necessary work that society needs but doesn't want to acknowledge, and you live with that contradiction however you can. The profession finally ended in most of Europe in the mid to late 20th century as countries abolished capital punishment. The last executioners retired or were reassigned to other government work, and that was that. Centuries of history ended. The position no longer needed, no more executioner families, no more dynasties, just over. Some of these final executioners wrote memoirs, talked about their experiences, tried to process what they'd done, what they'd lived through. The writings are strange, matter of fact in some ways, deeply troubled in others. You can sense them wrestling with it, the weight of all those lives, the years of carrying out state sentences, trying to understand their own role in it all. And now it's history. We study them, write about them, try to understand what their lives were like, look at their tools in museums, visit the houses they lived in, read their journals when they left them, try to glimpse the human reality behind the profession. What strikes me after all of this is how normal they were trying to be, living in this abnormal situation, marked and excluded and stigmatized, but still trying to live normal lives, raise their children, make a living, find some measure of dignity and purpose. They were people caught in a social system they didn't create and couldn't escape, making the best of impossible circumstances. Were they victims? In some ways, yes, trapped by birth or circumstance in a stigmatized profession. But they also participated in a system of punishment that was often brutal and unjust. They ended lives, some of people who probably didn't deserve it. They tortured confessions out of suspects. They were instruments of a harsh criminal justice system. So, it's complicated. They were both victims of stigma and participants in violence.
But mostly they were just people. That's what I keep coming back to. People living their lives, waking up each day and doing what they had to do to survive, loving their families, worrying about money, hoping for better futures for their children. The same basic human stuff that everyone deals with, just in a very particular and difficult context. The executioner's life in medieval Europe was strange and sad and surprisingly mundane all at once, marked by isolation and stigma, but also by the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Dark work mixed with regular work, moments of horror mixed with moments of tenderness, the extraordinary and the ordinary all tangled together. And for centuries, generation after generation, families lived this way, born into it, raised in it, died in it, passed it down to their children, until finally, slowly, the world changed enough that they didn't have to anymore. The stigma faded, the profession evolved, and eventually ended. Now they're history, names in archives, entries in town records, fading ink in old journals,
preserved houses and rusting tools in museums, subjects of historical study, and late-night YouTube videos designed to help people fall asleep. Their lives were hard, their work was grim, their social position was brutal, but they lived, they endured, they mattered, at least to themselves and their families, and now, centuries later, we remember them, try to understand them, acknowledge the strange, sad, complicated reality of what it meant to be the person who carried out society's harshest sentences while being excluded from that society in almost every other way. It's a lot to think about. But we've been thinking about it for hours now, and honestly, we're probably ready to stop thinking quite so hard. Let these stories settle. Let the information drift into the back of your mind, where it can process slowly, gently, while you fall asleep.
The executioners are long gone. Their world is long gone. We visited it, walked through their days, met some of them by name, seen their struggles and their small victories, and now we can let it go. Let it fade into the comfortable distance of history. So that's it. That's the story of how executioners lived their daily lives in medieval Europe. Strange work, hard lives, but lives nonetheless, full and complicated and surprisingly human. Good night. Thanks for listening to this very long exploration of a very dark corner of medieval social history. May your dreams be less complicated than the lives we've been discussing. And hey, at least you weren't born into an executioner family in 1450, so there's that. Small mercies. Good night.